Our guest today, Sarah Fortt with Vinson Elkins in Austin, Texas, is a force to be reckoned with when it comes to E&S issues, particularly corporate culture. I'm Brock Romanek. So Sarah, diversity and inclusion, workplace efforts, the hottest topic out there over this past year or so, and I can imagine it's going to continue. Well, climate change will rival that, I'm sure, over time. I mean, that's the whole of human species. When it comes to D&I and workplace efforts, which members of management typically get involved in that area?
So this is a really hot topic, you're right, but it's a hot topic that, interestingly, I think caught some companies by surprise in how hot it became, how quickly it got there. So I think there's still a lot of difference across companies with respect to where these efforts sit. I think traditionally it was an HR function. I think increasingly you're seeing companies hire chief diversity officers and similar positions to help oversee those types of efforts. I think also you're increasingly seeing board level involvement and interest. And so because of that, I think you see CEOs even get interested because they're being asked by their board members. I know from my perspective, I have several clients where the CEO is actually the one driving these efforts. So I think it's a senior role. It should be a senior role, a senior task.
So what's the first step in truly pressing for necessary change?
So I think traditionally companies would adopt policies. They might put something in their code of conduct. They might create a mentorship program, training programs. All of those can be great efforts. But I think increasingly it's important for companies to identify the problems before they try to solve them. And that creates its own separate set of challenges because it is an uncomfortable topic for some folks. I think really looking at the problem requires perhaps a level of bravery. There's also some risk involved from a legal perspective, so it is important to talk to legal counsel, employment and labor counsel around these efforts early on in the process. But I think ultimately it's important for companies to be willing to look at their data and really dive into what their data is telling them.
So at least in my experience, this is an area where there's been a lot of talk, but not a whole lot of action. You definitely see that when it comes to board diversity, but truly when it comes to workplace diversity. But now there's definitely a greater push for real action. So in your experience, what's been holding back companies from truly moving the needle in this area?
Sure. So I wrote an article recently on diversity and some of the issues that I think companies face with respect to actually making progress. But in summary, I think one of the large challenges, and whenever we're talking about any topic that pertains to corporate culture and diversity and inclusion definitely do, is the challenge around what I refer to as sacred cows. Sacred cows are the people, the principles, the policies, the practices that a company puts in place that it will protect at all costs. So it's that really valuable leader, that really valuable relationship or product that the company doesn't want to lose and will protect. And very often, it's important to say that most of the time, sacred cows are good things, right? They're things that make the corporation special. The problem is that companies don't always analyze them to see what types of risks they could be creating. So what that means from a diversity and inclusion perspective is you may not be analyzing how your compensation structure is rewarding people who perhaps have not received the types of training that they should in order to work with people who think differently from them or look differently from them. So it's issues like that that I think create barriers for companies to make meaningful progress. There's an unwillingness to have a conversation around certain topics. And a lot of times those topics are the areas where the corporation is protecting something, right? It's protecting something of value. And so I think increasingly it's important for companies to be, and for leadership to be courageous in their conversations around risk and in their conversations around diversity and inclusion.
And then how does corporate culture play out in terms of creating real change?
I'd also expect companies to consider issues around corporate culture, including diversity and inclusion, when doing things like reviewing and promoting managers. And they might want to seek outside advice in doing that, including legal counsel. One of the hard parts around corporate culture, one of the hard challenges in terms of implementing change in corporate culture is that very often the corporate culture is working for leadership, right? So leadership has one view of the corporate culture that's often informed by or then informs the glossy brochure that they put out, the poster that they put out on corporate culture. So I think the challenges around corporate culture are really being willing to, again, dive into the data and to ask people on the ground what their experience of the corporate culture is. And that includes doing things like employee satisfaction surveys and exit interviews, and really listening to what you hear without becoming defensive, which can be challenging.
And then what's the board's role in all this? I mean, culture always seems so amorphous, and of course the board is always considered this tone at the top. How does that all work?
It's a great question. So first, I would expect that companies that are doing this well, for the most part, are involving the entire board in the discussion, because it does have implications. Corporate culture, including diversity and inclusion, have implications across the corporation as broadly and as deeply as the corporate strategy. So I think it really does warrant an entire board conversation. I also think there's a question around how brave the directors are willing to be in the conversation, and the depth of the questions they're willing to ask around how the company is measuring, and there are ways to measure corporate culture, both quantitatively and qualitatively, how the company is measuring its corporate culture and its progress in achieving its cultural goals. And I think one of the key elements of that is a willingness to introduce what I would refer to as healthy disruption into the conversation. So healthy disruption is inviting new views, asking out someone who would otherwise be an outsider to the conversation to identify blind spots and help the group think of a problem or an issue in a different and new way. So often this could be introducing a diverse member onto the board if it's a board that traditionally hasn't been diverse. It can also be introducing outside expertise and really asking to be challenged, asking to be asked the hard questions.
I mean, culture is so important. I mean, it's one of the reasons I started my own company, because I can set my own culture. But yet, it's amazing that it's a new thing. It seems like in this day and age, even though we've been talking about corporate governance seriously now for 20 years, culture was always just sort of tone at the top. Just a few glib sentences. You're a leader. I mean, it really is amazing to see how insightful you are, and the article that you wrote was awesome, incredible.
Thank you. Thank you.